Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for December 8th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we are joined by John Hogoboom. Welcome, John.
Thanks.
Stan Nurilov. Welcome.
Hey, thank you.
And Matt Kaiser. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks.
I'm Brian Rexroad, and I guess first what we'd like to do is we're approaching the holidays, and we actually had talked a little bit previously about the SANS holiday hack, and perhaps, Matt, you can give us a little rundown on that.
Sure. So it's a yearly thing that SANS puts together. Ed Scotus was on the show a couple weeks back, and he was promoting for it. It sounds like it's going to be even more exciting than last year. I played last year. I had a lot of fun doing it. I think it's got challenges that are good for entry level as well as more advanced people. So I think everyone should always be able to get something worthwhile out of it.
Right.
And they always spend a lot of time working on this challenge.
And you don't even have to be an expert to do this. I mean, you can just kind of go in and start getting an idea of, learning some things in the process. It's an opportunity to do a little hacking in a legitimate way and get a little learning under your belt. So it sounds like a good thing to do. Now, what we thought we'd do for the program this week is last year we had made some, what I like to call forecasts. We had this discussion. We're not really, prophets of any sort. We can't really do predictions, but we can do some forecasts. We do a lot of analysis through the year. We see some trending that's taken place. We did some forecasting last year. We thought we'd take a little time and discuss our predictions or our forecasts from last year and see how well we did. And that'll be sort of a precursor to what we'll do in a subsequent week to discuss what our forecast might be for next year. So what we can do here is we'll start with you, John, and
I'm on the
share
hot
with
seat.
us what your forecast was from last year. And that's
So last year, my forecast was that APT is going to lose its novelty. And when I used the term novelty, I was kind of thinking of it in the context that it's kind of emerging from one of these things where it's only kind of whispered in back rooms by a small group of people, maybe in government or military space, to more mainstream. Everybody kind of knows about that. And I think a lot of that has actually come true. It's probably even true last year or the year before, but it's really in terms of both the amount of threat intelligence sharing organizations that have sprung up in this past year or so, such as Threat Connect, Threat Stream, Red Sky Alliance. There's all these different groups out there that kind of collate a lot of these threat indicators and make it available to the masses. So now everybody's kind of aware, in the loop, even though they might not be directly impacted by a lot of these nation-state actors targeting their particular sector. They're aware of what's going on in the various sectors and who's being targeted and whatnot, and how those threats are manifesting.
all right.
Also, I think that a lot of the large-scale breaches have been more publicized in the media than they have been in years past. I know that there's been a lot of various articles that kind of get a lot more attention, whereas in the old days, nobody talked about it, and the media didn't get looped in on the fact that some of these events even happened. And then the other thing I was going to mention is just looking back at the past year, I thought it was a little interesting in terms of the nation-state actors that we did see covered more, and both Russia. So there's the Russian breach where I guess it was APT 28, also SOFACI or Cozy Duke, goes by a bunch of different names based on their tool sets. But they had targeted the White House as well as NATO, and the previous year they had gotten into the State Department. So that was a pretty big story. Also, there was a Russian breach by the APT 29 group with the Hammer Toss tool set into the Pentagon email system, which, if everybody remembers, they actually had to shut down that email system. It was the unclassified email system for the Pentagon, but it was shut down for maybe a week or something, I think it was, back in the middle of the year, August timeframe. And then there's also TG2889, which is another group that's Iranian-based. We talked about this on the show as well. They've been kind of in the mix doing this tactic where they create a very sophisticated network of LinkedIn profiles, and then they try to coerce users to befriend them or LinkedIn with them so that they can use that as a means to further get inroads into those organizations and whatnot. And then I also mentioned Dooku 2.0, which came out. I won't mention who the principal actor set was behind that one. However, same operator as Dooku and Stuxnet, who I think we have some speculation as who might be behind that. So it's not all Chinese-based. China has been really the big boy in the room in terms of getting APT, nation-state espionage, really off the ground, cyber espionage. And it looks like a lot of these other countries are starting to get into the mix more and more now.
Yeah.
So.
I'm surprised you left out Equation Group, because I thought that
Well,
was
that's true.
that was
Yeah.
a report that described what I felt to be the most sophisticated.
It was very sophisticated.
I mean, really kind of almost, sci-fi in some respects compared to a lot of the other attack activities that have been described. So,
Right.
And
I just overlooked that one. You're right. That's it.
It just came to mind when you were describing Dooku. I said, but I think another aspect of this is probably perhaps very important to consider is, I don't know, what's your opinion? Do you think that this has kind of gone over the deep end? That is, maybe some things are being described as APT that really aren't, or at least accusing nation states that might even just be something simpler than that?
Well, I think there is a lot more overlap now and confusion, because I know there are toolkits that are being used by both nation-state actors as well as by crimeware, or just what I would call run-of-the-mill type of malware organizations, that they're not really looking to gather intelligence, more just that regular run-of-the-mill kind of malware thing. So I think the lines have gotten blurred a little bit, and sometimes things get accused when they shouldn't have been. I also think that there's a lot of media coverage and really good reporting that comes out of a lot of these tool sets. But for the most part, I would say 1% of the people who are actually reading them probably are even going to get impacted by them. Whereas for the most part, when you're talking about some of these other types of tool sets like Drydex and these things, which are run-of-the-mill malware, pretty much everybody's going to get them in your organization, because it's going to get spammed to all your users and whatnot. And you're going to come across that. But a lot of these APT-specific things, while it's really good to understand the tactics and techniques that they're using, more often than not, you're probably not going to see it. Or if you are, you're probably in a sector that has really interesting intelligence, like defense or aerospace, things like that.
Okay, one more question, and I'd like to also kind of make a point, though. But how do you think, and I mean, this is going to be somewhat speculative. I don't necessarily expect you to know the answer for each of you guys, but I'm interested in your opinion. Clearly, the information is more in the public domain, well recognized. Do you think organizations are really acknowledging or responding to it, becoming more prepared to protect themselves against these attacks? I see some blanks.
I'll chime in first. Say, in some respect, yes. I guess it depends on. I think at a very bare minimum level, at least some of the base indicators to look at or look for, and you can do a little retroactive looking. Whereas before, you might not have known anything, and it's just been happening in your network, and you have no idea. But I don't know that people are going to the next level and saying, "Well, let me follow this actor set, because I know they're not going to stay at this command and control. Yeah. They're going to change up their techniques and their tool sets that they're using. And am I going to be able to follow them on my own without somebody else giving me that intelligence?"
A good segue. You're actually leading into my next sort of statement here. But just before that, I think just my observation, having talking with customers and things, I think the large organizations are doing pretty well with that. Significant investment in the financial industry to help protect themselves against advanced attacks, whether it's organized crime or whether it's nation-state attacks, sophisticated attacks. They've been doing a lot of work on that. But I think we've also observed that the notion of threat intelligence sharing is understood by the advanced attackers, and that they are implementing countermeasures in a sense. So we've seen a lot more diversity in the command and control that they might be using to help make, that piece of the IP address information that you had about, a command and control server. Well, it was only used once, and it was, for one specific target, for one specific situation, for one specific event. It's useless to anybody else. So have a blast sharing it,
Well, I think that's the thing. It's very easy to share that kind of level of information, IP addresses, file hashes, things you can load and automatically look for. But sharing TTPs in a meaningful way that you can express it automatically and then take some sort of action without dedicating some sort of staffing to understanding it and then to, I don't know, doing a risk assessment or something like that.
Yeah.
That's a lot more work.
Yeah, I think you have it right on. What you really want to do in terms of threat sharing, or at least my opinion, sharing with you, is we want to get to a position where you're basically climbing the learning curve with the attackers as opposed to trying to understand what could be very diverse and automated management infrastructure. The next one here, I'm going to go ahead and go. This isn't exactly the order we covered them last year, but the next one was related to Internet of Things, and the prediction was that the issues that we had already been tracking were going to get worse. And well, I think I nailed it.
It's worse than it's ever been.
So anyway, let's talk about this one a little bit. First, I want to make a distinction. I think we've talked about this, but I'll formalize a little bit. I want to make a clear distinction between I don't know if it's fair to call them the Internet of Secure Things, but things that are at least prepared to be connected to a network, and distinguishing those from what I like to call the Internet of Insecure Things. So, the things that are prepared to be connected to a network are ones that are properly designed and tested for security attributes. And in fact, the best way to do it would be to also add a layer of network protections on top of that. There's, all systems are flawed. I'll share a few examples a little bit later on. All systems are flawed, and so it's a matter of whether those flaws have been discovered. The attackers are motivated to discover them. And so having additional layers that make it more difficult to either discover them or exploit those is certainly in your benefit. So talking first a little bit about the Internet of Insecure Things, some of the attributes that I have seen associated with these. First of all, and these are sort of in the order of, it should be obvious, at the top of the list. For Pete's sake, you should not be exposing unnecessary services to the internet. And we've seen a number of examples like this where small office, home office routers with services like network time protocol exposed to the internet. Why would a small office, home office router be a time server for the internet? Doesn't make sense. A DNS server exposed to the internet. Character generator, these all get used for reflective denial of service attacks. When you have these small devices connected all over the internet, it facilitates those attacks and certainly doesn't do anything for performance of the router. So, at the bare minimum, any device that's connected to the network, even local networks, but certainly to the internet, need to be tested for security correctness and any of the problems be corrected. Next one is weak or non-existent patch processes. That is invariably, as I mentioned earlier, they're all going to have flaws. Eventually they're going to be discovered. And so you must have a minimal touch process for correcting those. And, I think a lot of in fact, we have an example a little bit later on where some of the internet-connected televisions have pretty good update processes. Some of the connected cars have good update processes built into those and for over-the-air patching. There are others that don't have even any patching process, or if they do, there's no notification or even a user-friendly process of doing that. So very clear distinction. Some of the devices are actually deliberately exposed to the internet. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's an insecure thing and exposing to the internet, that's a bad thing. And so, we keep talking about it every week, these security surveillance DVRs that have things like telnet exposed to the internet, web interfaces that are exploitable.
With default passwords.
With default passwords. Hey, that's next. Certainly being exposed to the internet makes them internet exploitable. That is what we sometimes have called wormable, where the process of exploiting can be automated. There's no user touch associated with that. And then ultimately, it can turn into something that tries to exploit other things. So that's the process that we define as wormable. Great for botnets or botnet operators. Next one, default passwords. And a lot of devices have default passwords. Sometimes they're not even documented in the user documentation, but they are discoverable by folks that have an interest in doing that, and so that makes them potentially exploitable. And there really need to be better password management techniques. Just as an example, I would prefer that the default password, if there has to be a default password, that it be printed on the device.
Right.
So that, if you have to reset it or something and get back to the default password, it goes back to that something that's printed on the device, so that it's not something that's known to everybody in the world. These devices invariably don't have any virus installed on them. I don't know that they necessarily have to, but it's certainly an attribute that makes them potentially more exploitable. That is, if there are exploits, it certainly has a less chance of detecting that fact if there's nothing to detect it. Many of these devices are really based on just a handful of architectures. That makes it a lower learning curve for the folks that are trying to do the exploits. And as a consequence, it's a large payoff if they can get past that learning curve and be able to exploit a lot of different types of devices.
You don't mean like processor architectures here. You mean like...
Yeah, actually I do.
You do?
I do mean processor architecture. So if you can develop your malware for a processor architecture and be able to use that across a variety of different types of devices, which we've observed.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that later with the netis stuff.
Yeah.
That's true.
It goes
that
and fetches an initial payload that goes and fetches an Intel, an ARM, a MIPS version, and then just tries running each one. And the ones that aren't for its architecture just fail, but the one that is runs. But it doesn't even try to check to figure out which one it is.
I would come back and say that's great, but before we came to Internet of Things, you had x86.
That's absolutely true. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I think it's a little bit of a twisted observation, I would say, but it certainly is one that perhaps is not fully realized in the industry. That is, so long as the innards are the same, it doesn't matter what kind of package you put in it or how big the antenna is or whether it's got a camera or not, it's still effectively just exploitable in the same methods.
I agree with that. Okay.
One that I left off here, by the way, is they don't export telemetry for helping to detect events. A lot of these, if you look at larger devices, routers, firewalls, they export logs so that you can do analysis and look for anomalies and activities, or even a typical computer, it generates system logs that you can export or even analyze on the device. Many of these systems don't really have that facility.
I would say it depends on what device we're talking about.
It does depend
Things
on
like,
the device.
if your ISP provides you a router or a modem or a DVR, certainly those are sending back some kind of telemetry. Maybe not security telemetry, but something.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So it depends on the circumstances. When we get into the more autonomous, sensor type devices, this is going to become more of a
things that people buy off the shelf and set up themselves.
Yeah. Okay, and they're increasing capability. They're getting more bandwidth, memory, and CPU power, which again makes it more attractive. Doesn't necessarily make it more insecure, but certainly makes it more attractive as a target. And then the fact that they're always on. You basically connect them, forget them. The forgetting part is part of the issue here. Makes it great for botnets. Anyway, so those are some of the attributes that we find in the Internet of Insecure Things. So some of the examples over the last year. Most people are familiar with the Charlie Miller and Chris Vlasic GPAC demonstration that took place. It was basically televised even. I think they covered it on 60 Minutes, do I remember correctly? They did a recall, the manufacturer, Jeep, Chrysler, did a recall to be able to repair this. But that's a fairly arduous process. It would have been much better if they were able to do an over-the-air update. I don't find the flaw to be the fact that they were able to hack into things. Like I said, all software systems are flawed. When you find something, the real meat is in being able to repair that. That's my point of view. And I guess the sort of the other observation is they were able to successfully demonstrate it. And there were some network protections in place, but perhaps not sufficient enough to really control the scope of the impact. That is, they were able to get on a mobile network and be able to traverse that network to get to another peer mobile network device. And that potentially could have been controlled a little bit better. So another layer would have been best. Early in the year, I think it was in February, BMW had done an over-the-air update to fix the security flaw. I think we could talked about that on this program. And that's a beginning of a good thing. I think it was actually perhaps a little bit of a marketing thing that they stated this, but clearly it was a good thing. In the television space, last week I think it was, we talked about, Symantec did a report where they were able to get ransomware on their connected television. I think it was the question, the ransomware wasn't really targeting televisions, and we talked about some of these, but the significance is that, it isn't a possibility to infect a television. And I think the point here is that the browser, as on the one hand, we've talked about internet connected things and, perhaps potentially exploitable from the internet. A lot of the devices that are sort of protected within a home network are perhaps a little less susceptible to those things. But as more and more users are browsing to the internet that is connecting to things that are not in a controlled manner, it creates this larger surface area for exploit. So that's an example we talked about. And then we talked about the Vizio television example where they had a certificate vulnerability, but they were able to do a software update. So, basically you turn on the television, it says you need to do a software update and prompts you for it. And that's a low touch method. So a good thing in that regard. There's an article about connected toys and how, more and more smaller, and kids' toys were becoming connected. And then some potential vulnerabilities were described associated with Hello Barbie. And it's still not exactly clear to me, the extent of the circumstances there, but that's one that's sort of still playing out a little bit. And then last but not least here, numerous small office, home office router have demonstrated issues, not just flaws, but surprisingly, in my opinion, a lot of them have back doors. And where a lot of folks feel that that's really their security perimeter for their local network at their home. The fact that there's a covert backdoor in some of these devices is, I think, significantly concerning, and needs to be. And again, most of those devices really don't have a good patching process in place today. So anyway, I think the Internet of Things thing is. I think we're still in. I'll say the adolescent phase, perhaps somewhere between infant and adolescent phase in terms of what it means from a security standpoint. We expect a significant proliferation. We're getting into the retail space. Last year, we were talking about light bulbs, remotely, connected light bulbs. What is it this year? In the retail space, what are the internet connected things that you're seeing?
Well, we've seen those. There were crock pots and things like that.
Crock pots.
I think Belkin extended their line to like other devices as well.
Yeah.
The other day, I was at a store and they had like an egg holder. So presumably you buy eggs, put all your eggs in the special container.
So it's measuring the eggs in there.
It knows how many eggs you have.
Wait, are you putting
it connects to the internet?
And it connects to the internet, to the cloud.
You're literally putting all of your eggs in one internet-connected basket.
Wow.
Okay, so now we just talked about some toys here. So the reason I brought that up is because it really is. I think we're really still just scratching the surface in terms of the number of things that actually can be connected. I think earlier in the year we talked about trash cans being connected to the internet and some others. So it's I think it's going to continue to grow. And we were just talking a little bit ourselves about the Raspberry Pi Zero, which is the less than $5 computer that's coming out. They sold out right away, but as that progresses, as the cost of computers goes down and the ability to connect things, the number of things that it makes cost effective to include it go up significantly.
I just hope that people stop and think whether they should.
Right. Just because it's cheap doesn't mean you should just let it hang out on the internet with exposed ports and services, because somebody else can use it.
It becomes a matter of risk and convenience, and the important part is that the folks that are weighing these things off understand it. Usually the convenience is kind of in your face, the risk perhaps not, and so that's
it's important to know if you have eggs at home in your refrigerator, so that egg
it is nice.
Let me tell you, my wife would want that.
Yeah. And it was on sale, so I don't think they'll be issuing patches.
Especially this time of year, a lot of people are baking, and those eggs, they go fast.
I got a marketing idea. We need to make a camera that works inside the refrigerator that can articulate with a light on it, so you could look inside your refrigerator from work.
There we go.
Right?
There we go.
And then get your shopping list together.
Well, you should be using the ones that have the barcode scanners built in.
Yeah, that's too much of me.
I thought we were going to be discovering who took that last piece of pie, but okay. All right, so Matt, let's go to you. And you were going to talk, I guess last year you talked a little bit about the vulnerabilities. We had just come off of
Shellshock and Heartbleed,
Yeah.
which were huge, absolutely huge. I mean, they were important because not only were they, things that you could easily exploit over the internet without too much trouble. I mean, the vulnerabilities ran deep in things that everybody was using. You had Bash and you had the SSL libraries, OpenSSL, and it affected everybody.
Yeah.
And I had, looking at that, I said, this is probably the start of something scary. We might be seeing more of these kinds of widespread vulnerabilities that affect all sorts of systems in the future. And I'm not sure that we did. We saw some pretty interesting bugs in 2015, but I don't know that we've seen anything quite on the scale of those.
Yeah, Heartbleed was special.
It was.
It really was special in my opinion because it was remotely exploitable. There was really very little you could do to protect against it. And it really kind of gave the keys to it. It had the potential, at least, that is the ability to throw packets and have it spit back private key information that potentially could have not just compromised previous sessions, but future sessions as well, if you weren't in a position to protect against it. So that was special, but nevertheless.
Even though I would say Heartbleed was special, it was easy to identify in terms of,
If
do
you're
I have an
monitoring.
exposure here?
Oh, yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
Shellshock, who knows? The
Yeah.
depth of whether Bash is in play in so many of these different
point.
things was very difficult to figure out.
Yeah.
Not easy to test for necessarily. So.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I mean, because there were so many circumstances in which case it could show up.
Right, right.
So I tried to collect what we found this year and sort of do an overview of what was close to that level of impact and what was sort of a fizzle. The first one on the list is stage fright, which was the bug in an Android image preview library that was most famous for being exploitable through an MMS message. So someone sends you a message over your phone and you've got instant ownage. So that, by itself, in the absence of everything else, should be quite scary. And it did get a lot of hype around Black Hat. It got a lot of press, and there were more bugs in the same family. It discontinued for a while, but I'm not entirely convinced that this had the same kind of impact as a Shellshock or a Heartbleed. It's Android, and while that's a widespread operating system at this point, it's really not as big as the systems that Shellshock and Heartbleed compromised.
Right.
Well, you'd also have to have like a list of MMS or people that you're going to send messages to, right?
Well,
Whereas
but
you
if
could scan the internet ubiquitously, but to MMS bunch of
I know for a fact that people were using Shellshock across, the same way you can auto dial a whole bunch of numbers, people were scanning the IP ranges and just spewing out their payloads to all the boxes they could
Well,
hit.
and trying to grab server content, databases, right?
So, I mean, I think that the people who are using it for just mass chaos, it had that potential still. But mitigation was pretty easy. I mean, a user could go into the menu and turn off the MMS functionality, manually download it. So that if someone sent you one of these messages, you would say, I have no idea who that is, and you'd never be attacked. You'd never be infected.
Right.
And the handsets after Android 4.0 had ASLR enabled, which made it harder, and they eventually did patch that in the latest. Now, that being said, I think it had a major impact on the history of legacy Android systems. To me, this kind of a bug says, I should probably just throw away that phone I've been keeping that I might want to use someday. Because this exists, it's not going to get patched in most cases. So it was important. I'm just saying it's not on that same tier as Shellshock and Heartbleed.
Yeah, actually, forgive the digression here, but that's one of the things I didn't mention about the Internet of Things thing, is to have a clear life cycle support.
That's a good point.
Defined for in terms of what's the good if you have a good patch process if there's nobody creating the patches, right? So forgive the digression, but I think you made a good point there. That is, lifecycle support around these vulnerabilities is an important aspect of being able to protect yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Glad you brought that up. So there was one bug that came out in the last few months that I think should have gotten more attention, which is the Java deserialization bug. It turns out that Java does use serialization and deserialization, which is taking data objects, packaging them for shipping to some other process or some other system, and then unpacking them. It turns out that you could, depending on what was done with that object immediately afterwards, some systems were treating it as trusted content and doing things that you wouldn't necessarily want to do with untrusted content, and you could get code execution using this bug. And it was found in a very common library that's used for many Java applications. So it is fairly widespread, and it does have a lot of impact. And if someone just wanted to connect to your system and use it, I don't know why it didn't get as much press as it is. Maybe because people were tired of hearing about Java vulnerabilities. But I think, of all the ones that were there, this one was kind of special.
Yeah, I can only speculate myself. I think that you kind of pointed it out a little bit earlier with the Android thing, that is the distinction between server vulnerabilities and client vulnerabilities may be somewhat the difference here. That is, if I understand, the Java serialization vulnerability is really a client-side vulnerability. And am I correct about that?
I think it's one of those bugs where it really depends on how the data is being treated, who's sending what.
That's absolutely.
So I wouldn't call it
side. I thought it was a server side, but
Yeah, I think you can do it on the server.
most of the
send an
applications
side or
object to
client
the
side.
server,
Most of the applications that I saw it identified positively in were servers.
Okay.
But I wouldn't go so far myself to say that it's clearly a server or a client bug.
Okay.
So,
And just for the audience here, I don't know everything.
nor do I.
I learn as much from these programs as folks that are listening to the program, I hope so. Hope to. So, okay.
So the next big name bug, and then of course all important bugs must have
Must have
names
good
and
names,
logos,
right? Yeah.
was Venom. And this one was pretty interesting as well. It's a vulnerability in the virtual floppy disk driver of QEMU, which is pretty well used across a bunch of different virtualization products. VM compromise is a big deal. Typically, if you're doing something like a malware analysis, or you've got a virtual box set up specifically so that if it gets infected, you can just wipe it out. Being able to escape that virtual jail is a big deal. Turns out that it was fairly easily patched. As far as I can tell, most of the systems that it was affected by were patched. But still, this was a pretty big deal. I think virtualization, if it was, I still see it mostly as an enterprise mechanism or an enterprise tool. And I think if this was more of a consumer grade tool, people would be worrying about it a little bit more. And scanning for virtual machines, actually no, this one you actually had to be within the VM. You had to get execution before this even was worth anything to you, which is not impossible, of course, but it's nowhere near the kind of one and you're done kind of vulnerability you could just scan the internet for, like the other two I mentioned.
The thing that sticks in my mind about this is why the heck do we even need a virtual floppy drive?
Well, that's the thing. It's legacy. It's I guess somebody somewhere decided you need to be able to plug your ancient floppy disks into your brand new and shiny VMs.
Yeah, amazing.
Maybe you're installing Windows 3.1. Who knows?
Could be. And please don't do that. Okay, so good.
So the next one on the list was Freak, which was an SSL TLS downgrade attack, which is cool. Bugs that have to do with SSL and TLS are, by their nature, important to the safety of the internet. So it did get the press it deserved. It did affect a lot of servers, but it was a downgrade attack. And it's valuable to, I would say, a much more limited set of attackers than any of the big names of 2014.
So it really just gets you in a position where you can do some cryptanalysis.
Exactly.
And it would be computationally possible.
Yes.
And you'd have to repeat it many times. It's not like you get the whole keys of the kingdom.
Correct.
You get to knock on the door really hard.
It was interesting in that it brought back into the light the idea of export ciphers, which is something from the early crypto wars of the 90s, when people decided, well, we'll let you have crypto, but we'll let you have sort of a borked version of it because you're outside of the United States or whatever restrictions were in play. So interesting from a historical standpoint for certain, and sort of a wake-up call to people who still had them enabled for some reason in this era, but not the biggest. Ghost was one that I thought was going to have a lot more impact, and sort of for the same idea as Shell Shock, where it was one of those bugs that it wasn't everything, it was in glibc, and it was in a situation where in order to find if you were really affected by it, you might have to go and look at all your code and say, am I making these particular calls? You can always just go ahead and patch. The things that held this one back were that apparently it was patched in 2013 already, so there was already a patch available by the time it was announced and promoted. And it was arbitrary code execution, except you needed to be able to control calls that the system was making for get host by name, which is a very specific call for looking up a host name, which by the way is
depreciated.
Exactly. So it had some very cool potential, but it wasn't that great. Sorry. Then I thought that one was going to be the big one for the year until people started coming up with here's the hoops you have to jump through in order for it to work. And the last one I included kind of for fun, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was the iOS Cortex DOS attack, which you send it to somebody and their phone goes beep. I just made a note. What I'm trying to say is it was a denial of service. Your phone would appear to crash. But again, just denial of service. But of all the bugs here, it's the only one that I saw my friends outside of the security realm playing with, and they would send it to each other. So, in terms of a social impact, I think it was probably the biggest one.
Yeah, just about anybody could do it. It didn't take it. You just had to have an example that somebody sent to you, or you found and were able to actually send that out to somebody else. So, yeah, good point on that. Although that it doesn't really qualify as a multi-platform type
It does not.
target. It was a relatively specific target in that case. So I guess the significance here, you kind of started out that you didn't feel that you had done that well. Personally, I mean, with all the examples that you came up with, it seems like we did have a number of things.
It was a year of strong contenders, but it wasn't a year of cataclysmic bugs. And that's, I think, where we missed the mark. I think in any given year, you're going to have significant bugs like this, but nothing quite so game-changing.
But I think what we're seeing, in my opinion, more now over the past couple of years is people are really inspecting a lot of these common open source libraries that everybody's using. That are like glibc, except for this last iOS one, which is more of an anomaly, but like glibc, I can't remember what the other ones were that you had there, but there's a bunch of these common libraries that are used across a lot of different tool sets that import them and use them, and they're open source. You can go inspect the code, and I think people are doing that more to look for flaws. On the heels of the whole Heartbleed, Shell Shock, some of these other, it seems like there's a lot more of that activity going on than maybe had been before. Just my observation.
It's true.
So I think you're right in that this is a trend that people are really looking for more of these types of bugs.
We just haven't found them yet.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, Stan, let's go to you now. And I guess the prediction was a rise in mobile malware, and I think specifically iOS-based, because we've seen some growth certainly in the Android space. But tell us, what do you think? And this was Jim's prediction, so you're kind of proxying for Jim today, but
It wasn't
tell
a
us what you
prediction,
think.
it was a forecast.
It was a
We
forecast.
don't predict
yeah.
things here.
Thanks for correcting me.
I guess what we were saying, like you said, is that the volume and the activity around mobile malware is going to increase. And I was trying to find something on the internet that's going to help me, show that in a picture. Yeah, some article that came out or something like that. And to be honest, I couldn't find anything. I saw a lot of graphs from 2013, 2014 when people were ramping up and really excited about the growth of mobile malware. I couldn't find anything for 2015. But that doesn't mean that mobile malware hasn't increased over the past year.
Everybody's waiting until 2016 until they put out their 2015 summary report, right?
Yeah, I think so. So specifically in iOS, I started kind of looking, and on this show, we talked about iOS bugs and iOS malware at least 15 times over the past year. And to me, it's once a month. And for a platform that's, kind of like a walled garden, that's still quite a bit. Now, granted, probably half or more of the bugs were for rooted devices. So devices that somebody did
Jailbroken, yeah.
Jailbroken.
Yeah, I think that was and that was, I think, one of the fundamental defining criteria or distinguishing criteria that we were concerned about is that malware associated with non-jailbroken devices, and to the extent that folks that are trying to stay within the protected boundaries that are provided, are they still protected?
Right. And
Well, is it jailbroken devices or this app stores that are permitted once you're jailbroken?
I think that it's both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it depends. Obviously, a piece of malware has to be delivered to you. But even some of the APT-based malware, like Xcode Ghost, that came out this year or was talked about this year, that one depended on you having your iPhone jailbroken. So, but you couldn't get it at the store anywhere. You really had to have your phone jailbroken. And then there's other things, like there's some libraries that were commonly used by developers, like SDKs, that had some malicious logic in there. But they were predominantly being used to support development of apps in like Taiwan and China and things like that. So there was some big stuff like that didn't maybe require being jailbroken, but the rise in interest in that has increased. One more thing that I kind of was looking for to gauge the increase in mobile malware is the amount of systems out there that are available online, kind of like VirusTotal, that are dedicated to mobile malware analysis online. And I came across actually two pretty interesting ones. I saw they didn't have a lot of samples, but just by the virtue of investing money and time into building a system like that, that speaks to me that we really have to ramp up our analysis capability because the threat is there. A lot of people are moving to iOS-based and non-iOS-based, Android-based tablets, iPhones, regular phones, and so having that analysis capability is very important. So just by seeing that there are a lot of really nice fancy websites out there where you can upload your APK file or something like that, that to me means yes, we're prepared, we're ready, and there has definitely been an increase in first adoption of the devices and malware existing for them.
All right, very good.
So Jim was right.
Jim was right. Okay, so what we're going to do here, we're going to grade each other. So for your own story, you don't grade yourself. That would be a little weird, right? So the other three are going to go kind of great. So we'll start with you, John, or your story. And Stan, I'd like, on the APT story.
Remember.
Well, I always give John an A+ for all the work he does.
I can see this isn't going to work. What's your rating?
Yeah, I think John gets an A.
An A?
I thought it was a very pedestrian kind of forecast of mine. So I don't really necessarily, even though I'm grading myself, I would give myself less of a score than you guys have given.
You're very hard on yourself, John.
So, but anyway, go ahead.
I'll give him B+. Okay, so second story was my own, and I'm going to hold my ears so I can't tell what you're saying.
D-. No, just kidding. No, really, my opinion would be an A, or whatever. I don't know if A+, but an A, because that really, this year has been inundated with IoT in terms of just the stories we've covered and what we see in the internet weather. So
Go ahead, Stan. What do you think?
I totally agree with that. We've
Really?
covered many more stories about IoT, and I think the classification now that you're making about secure things and unsecured Internet of Things is very important and something to keep our eye on for 2016.
What do you think, Ben?
I would also give you an A for the same reasons.
So I'm going to break the rules. I'm going to give myself a B, and I'll tell you the reason why.
Okay.
Because of that distinction to some extent, there's this. I think there are certain industries that are doing pretty well at protecting themselves, and so they're not growing in any significant way. That is, when they found a vulnerability in the cars, they got fixed. And there is a structure around fixing cars, for example, and if you're, a lot of the folks that are concerned about some things are related to, the biggest hype of the year was really around cars. Well, there is a means to protect or correct issues with cars. Some more convenient than others, but there's still a means around that. And in terms of the diversity of devices that are really exhibiting problems right now, it still hasn't really manifested itself. That is, we've been reporting on the security surveillance camera DVRs for at least 2 years now, if not 3, and the home routers have, it's perhaps grown some. So I'm a little personally disappointed in the prediction or the forecast, in the sense that I expected more devices to show up, and there still is that potential for it, but it hasn't happened yet. So anyway, that's
okay. I think in terms of dominance of coverage, I think we covered a lot of IoT.
We did,
this
absolutely.
year.
Absolutely we did. So Matt, for Matt's story, I should say. What do you think, John?
I'll give it a B. I like the topic, but you're right. We didn't really hit the mark in terms of a giant, groundbreaking vulnerability that really made us all kind of get into a war room and try to figure out how we're going to deal with this.
Yeah. And that I'm not disappointed about that fact.
No, I'm not either. I'm happy that didn't happen.
I'm feeling kind of kind today, but I would give it an A because something you mentioned actually. It's these vulnerabilities that people started looking more into. So I think your point was that we'll see more of these vulnerabilities being studied in some of these foundation kind of libraries. And I think that's what's happened. Over this year, it's actually something you mentioned, John, right? More people have started looking at these libraries that we use, and I think that's caused some of the stories.
Then you should probably give the security community an A. and give me a more appropriate grade.
Yeah, I agree. I would say B as well. I think it's. I think we've. It's like John said. We haven't seen that. The repeat of the shell shock or heart bleed, right? So, but I think it kind of dovetails into the story that you covered, Stan, in the sense that one of the more significant Apple, that is iOS application vulnerabilities that existed, or Trojans, malware that existed, was based on download of a Trojan library that, like John was referring to, got used across a large number of apps, snuck into the store, and later had to be sort of eradicated. And so we'll go on and then go to the story that you covered. And we'll grade Jim and Proxy here. So what do you think, John?
I'd still give that like a B, maybe a high C. Only because I don't know. I didn't see the mobile malware I don't think we covered it as much as we did maybe the year before. Yeah. There was a lot of Android malware in 2014, and I don't know that we had as many stories to cover.
Not as many notable.
Not as many notable or groundbreaking ones.
So some, and it's sort of interesting that as we grade the better grades in this, a bad grade is actually a good thing.
Yeah, it's true.
So I'm not disappointed that there have been less, fewer stories about Android, and we really haven't seen any significant problems in iOS. But
yeah, I would give it a B minus probably. I mean, the one thing that sticks out in my mind, probably because it's catchy, was that the Verizon DBIR had a section. I think it was titled, "I've got 99 problems, but mobile malware's not one." Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I still think that the people who are doing the metrics and figuring out if this is still really a big problem, they're not convinced yet, and so neither am I.
Yeah, I guess to sort of the counter argument there is I suspect that the advanced actors have capabilities that exist. Mm-hmm. We're just not seeing them in wide.
Well, that's. I think we did see something in the hacking team leak, didn't we?
Wasn't that the Xcode Ghost?
Yeah.
Was that Xcode? No, I'm not sure about that. Either way, I'm fairly sure that we did see that they, as a boutique shop, they were developing for those platforms. And I would assume that anybody who was similarly resourced would also be, developing for those platforms. Mm-hmm. But in terms of a widespread problem?
Yeah, it's not widespread, and that is part of the challenge or the problem. That is, if it isn't widespread, it's less likely to get into the sort of the open community and recognized or even discovered in the first place.
True.
I think those are things we're probably going to be covering maybe years from now. Kind of like the APT has always been around, but maybe 2-3 years ago is where it really blew up and everybody was interested. There's stuff going on with these devices now that we probably don't know much about, but 2-3 years from now, somebody will kind of piece it together and say, this was actually happening in 2015, 2014.
Well, I was thinking the opposite direction is, at what point do these stories feel like they're passé when we're picking them for the show? We go, oh boy, another one of these.
True.
So maybe they're not as well represented because we're just fatigued with them.
Yeah. Well, you're making a good segue to the Internet Weather Report.
There's a lot of fatigue in there.
Yeah.
So I would give it about a C or a B minus as well for Jim's forecast. So, I guess what we're going to do next week is talk a little bit about our forecast for next year, and I got a feeling there's going to be a little bit of overlap. We'll have to see how that pans out.
I think I've got a good new one.
Good. All right, so looking at the Internet Weather Report, we'll jump right into the top 10 most probed ports at the top of the list, port 23, followed by port 80 and 443. Not a lot of movement on this one. The 1900 UDP following that, 22 TCP following that. Those two moved down just a slot or two here. The biggest movement was on 53.413. We talked about that last week. We're going to revisit it again here today. And then followed by 445 TCP, 3389. And then port 21 TCP. Most of the port 21 that we've been seeing that gets it up on the list is actually sort of research-oriented. It's not considered innocuous in behavior in itself. And then the 3389 is still password guessing against remote desktop protocol, which we've seen some really crazy examples around that in the past, where like small restaurant cash registers are accessible
RDP,
through remote desktop protocol
systems.
So that's one that certainly, if you're in a medium-sized or small business, you want to pay attention to that.
And there's still more out there. If you hook a machine up to the internet with RDP and a nice simple password on it, like password, Mordo will get that thing like within a couple hours.
No time flat, yeah, absolutely. So it's not, it doesn't rank up as high as some of the others, but it's certainly one you want to be paying attention to. In terms of the scam probes on port 23 TCP, that's obviously telnet, remote login here. Looking at the last 90 days of activity here, it's actually gone down over the last couple of weeks. Basically looking back about a week here, it's continued to go down from where we had seen, but I anticipate that it's going to jump up sometime in the near future. And then looking at the number of sources doing that probing on port 23, that has not diminished as significantly as the number of probes. It basically suggests that perhaps the more loaded systems are the ones that are dropping off later, and so the number of IP addresses is dropping off at a lower rate. Looking at port 53.413 UDP, now this is that netis router backdoor. In this case, we're looking at the number of probes that are occurring on the port. Last week, we saw a significant number of those probes, not as many over the last week or so. It's still relatively significant. Remember, we're looking, in this case, at hundreds of millions of probes per hour is the scale that we're looking at here, almost in the order of billions per hour. However, conversely, if we look at the number of sources doing that probing, the number of source addresses, basically the number of participants in the botnet that are doing this probing, that has not dropped anywhere near as much. So the ones that are participating still are doing it lower and slower, perhaps to hide from the radar a little bit better. We're looking at still on the order of about 50,000 sources within the last week that had been doing that probing just in the last day or so, on the order of about 35,000 sources. And so what I did is I took a group of that around 35,000 sources, took a small sampling, just short of 500 of the addresses, randomly sampling through that set, and just did a geographic mapping of those to try to show where the concentration is. And the biggest concentration is actually in China and in other parts of Asia. We see some in South America, some in Europe, a little bit of a concentration in, I guess, the southern portion of Europe there. Not so many in the United States. So, I'm not sure if you call that a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a little bit of a different distribution than you typically see for this type of activity. Now, John, you'd helped with a little bit of analysis. I covered this last week as well, so probably won't go into as much detail here today, but perhaps you have an observation or two about the packet
No real
capture
observation other than I wasn't on the show last week, but it's an interesting payload in that these devices can just spew them out as UDP, so you don't have to establish a connection. You can just spew them out, and in the payload is the instruction that you want this thing to do. So if it hits a machine that's vulnerable to the netis exploit or this backdoor, it will follow the instruction. A lot of them just goes and downloads an initial payload, and then that initial payload probably goes, like I said, it'll go fetch malware binaries for various platforms, Intel, ARM, MIPS, and then just try to execute them all in series. And one of them will work, the other ones will just fail, and then the machine's infected. And then it goes from there, and then they begin scanning for additional devices and whatnot, so, or whatever instructions they give to them.
Now, I'm going to speculate. I don't think we ever got to that point, but speculate that these are generally being exploited for the purpose of denial of service attacks. But
it's good. I don't know. I haven't really tied them directly to denial of service attacks, but they're definitely engaged in more recruiting and scanning for additional devices to compromise. So that wormable type of thing. Once they get compromised, they start looking for more devices similar to themselves that they can compromise.
All right, good. Looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, we see port 23 here. Now, I think when we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, it was taking up more than half the pie chart. So that's diminished somewhat. That was reflected in actually the graph we looked at a little bit earlier, where we were looking at the number of sources doing the probing on port 23. This is followed by 53.413. We've already just talked about that one. The next one that's a little bit surprising here and actually moved up 917 spots in terms of the top rankings. It's 2332 TCP. We're going to take a little closer look at that in a moment. Followed by 445 TCP, and then basically we have 22 TCP showing up there with some other P2P activity showing up. So looking at 2332 TCP, here we have the number of sources doing that probing, and Actually, I don't know if this is a coincidence or not. We looked at the more recent probing on 53.413, and it was up around 35 or 40,000 sources. This one also is up around 35 or 40,000, between 35 and 40,000 sources. I don't know if that's a coincidence or not.
I did do an overlap analysis, and it was very
Not much
few
overlap, right.
less than 1% in terms of the IP addresses scanning 53.413 versus 23.32.
Yeah.
But that being said, similar types of devices, DVRs. There's one particular brand that's very heavily concentrated in this 2332 TCP, but there are other flavors of things going on with just a big predominance. So there's one which I have not identified yet. I just didn't get a chance to at this point.
All right. And then looking at the number of probes here, significantly lower number than we had seen on the other. The other was in the scale of hundreds of millions per hour. This is in the scale of tens of millions per hour, peaking up around about 57 million probes per hour. So not as significant there. Now, interesting, if we look at the geographic map of this one, again, a sampling. This is a little bit of a bigger sampling, so it looks a little denser. But if we look at this geographic distribution compared to the 53.413 geographic distribution, as I pointed out earlier, that distribution was a little bit unusual to see it heavily concentrated in Asia and Southern Europe. Here we have, again, a big concentration in Asia and Southern Europe. So I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's some relationship between the two here in terms of the types of devices and the prominence of those devices.
Right.
So that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at att.threattrack@list.att.com. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes. And you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. I'd like to thank you, Stan, for joining us today. It's good to have you back. Matt, good to have you back. And John, it's good to have you back. You've been out for a few weeks here.
Yeah, I've missed a couple of shows, but good to be back.
I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode to talk a little bit about predictions, I believe.
Forecasts.
Thanks for correcting my own correction. And as we said, and until then, keep your network safe.